what is ORRChem, the Swiss Chemical Reduction Ordinance? What is this, and what's been updated here? Right. All right. So first of all, Swiss ORRChem is something the updates aren't that severe, but it's something I wanted to start making you aware of, because sometimes we forget about in Europe that there's national legislation for us to consider. Right. And when we look at ORRChem, we have to understand, first of all, that Switzerland's not an EU member country. They're not a European Union member, and they're not a signatory of the EEA either. So they're not a member of the European Economic Area too. So none of the EU directives and regulations are directly applicable in Switzerland. They have no obligation to do that. What they've done is they've maintained their access to the European market through bilateral agreements with the member states. So in other words, they've made agreements that, hey, we'll maintain our kind of free trade agreement with you. And in return, we'll make sure that our requirements are in harmonization with EU requirements. So in other words, we can act in the single market. And so what that's done is it's done through the Swiss Chemical Reduction Ordinance, ORRChem, right? And ORRChem basically is, Switzerland's kind of, it's like the US TSCA, it's their chemical regulation. It's like REACH, but it's much more. So this regulation actually covers all the requirements, all the EU substance management regulations, chemical management regulations. So it covers RoHS, covers REACH, it covers persistent organic pollutants, things like that. And because it covers all those European requirements, it allows Switzerland to participate in the market. But it also includes requirements that are specific for Switzerland, which are not part of EU requirements. And as such, just simply complying with the EU regulations does not mean you're automatically compliant with ORRChem. So you'll want to take a look at ORRChem as an independent requirement and see if there's any gaps from your EU compliance efforts that you need to fill in order to be able to be compliant with ORRChem and sell in Switzerland. When we look at the annexes for ORRChem, we can see that it really does cover kind of all the different EU regulations it needs to cover. So you see 2.18 is RoHS, right? We can see there at 1.17 is Annex 14, right? The authorization list. So they have the same kind of authorizations and things going on as under EU REACH. So they're supporting that. We have the CMR 1.10. So they're tracking the EU stuff fine. But then there's other areas here which go above and beyond EU requirements. For example, the PFAS under 1.16. I'm going to give you an example of that. Halogenated organic substances has requirement you can't find in EU regulations. So it's not an exact mirror of EU requirements. And so you don't want to just simply say, oh, I got CE mark, I don't have to worry about ORRChem, but rather you want to, I'm not saying that you'll have much extra work to do, but what I'm saying is you want to at least review it and see if this regulation presents any other requirements which you're not currently meeting. An example here is in March of 2022, they revised ORRChem, and they did that basically to further align with the POPs recast, the persistent organic pollutants recast, and also with recent changes to REACH Annex 17. So basically they took the EU updates and they've adopted those into ORRChem. When they did that revision, they made some other changes too, to both annexes. As a result, we see that there's a new PFAS restriction that's been added to ORRChem, and it restricts PFHXS down to 25 parts per billion in some applications. 25 parts per billion is a very, very small amount, especially considering that while there is a similar proposal in the EU, it hasn't been adopted in the EU. So currently in the EU, PFHXS is only subject to SVHC reporting at 1,000 parts per million. So if you had 900 parts per million of this substance present in an article within your product, you would have no obligation under EU to do any reporting. It would not be restricted. On the other hand, you'd be violating ORRChem. So this is why an example of what I'm saying. You want to go ahead and review this regulation just to try to identify if there's any additional requirements you need to be capturing.
Learn more by viewing the full-length video online at greensofttech.com/videos. Plus, learn about our environmental regulation solutions online at greensofttech.com.